What'd you miss? Stocks closing in the green with the S&P 500 touching a record high during the session, now closing at its highest level since January.
I'm Caroline Hyde.
I'm Scarlett Fu.
And I'm Joe Weisenthal. And if you're tuning in live on Twitter, we want to welcome you to our closing bell coverage every weekday from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern.
We begin with our market minutes. The S&P 500 made an all-time high during the session today. It didn't hold that high, though, and it's come off and has now closed up about 1/5%.
But it still counts.
It still counts. You have an 8 out of 11 groups higher in the S&P. The real estate investment trust, staples, and utilities, some of your defensive sectors, finishing in the red. The discretionary stocks, and here we're talking retailers, home builders, automakers, finishing as the best performers here, up by 0.9%. Let's get to some individual movers here. We'll start with those consumer names because TJ Maxx, or TJX, I should say, because it's the parent company of TJ Maxx and Marshalls, said comparable sales rose 6% in the second quarter, 3 times more than what analysts have been looking for. That boosted the shares. Toll Brothers, another consumer discretionary name, the biggest U.S. luxury home builder, reported rising orders, revenue, and backlog. And Coty, which is the makeup company, the cosmetics company, saw a 3.4% decline in consumer beauty, the mass market segment, because of the trucker strike in Brazil and some supply chain disruptions. The stock closing off by better than 7%. And just a quick mention here of what we've seen in the online brokerage space. JP Morgan rolling out this new platform that includes free research and some free trading to its retail customers. That put pressure on the likes of E-Trade, Charles Schwab, and TD Ameritrade.
All right, quick look at the government bond market. The U.S. 2- and 10-year rates higher across the board. Nothing too dramatic. 10-year yield hasn't gone anywhere in a while, just hanging in there. 2.84% spread between the 2-10, still there at 24 basis points.
Kicking on to currencies, check out what's been happening to the US dollar. Of course, it's been a down day, off by 0.4%. It's the worst day that we've seen since August the 8th. Of course, comments still spilling over from this time yesterday when Trump was calling, well, sort of complaining about the overall Fed policy. But also it seems to be about Chinese hopes that maybe the trade tensions can be dialed back a little bit. Meanwhile, look at that great British pound, up 0.8%. Remember, it's been battered, but there's many hopes on the talks between Dominic Raab, the UK Brexit Secretary, and, of course, the EU counterpart Michel Barnier. They're progressing in Brussels. Meanwhile, it's been dollar weakness versus the yuan. We know it's been up about 0.1% higher. PBOC set the reference rate higher, and also really retorting about being a currency manipulator, saying, hey, look, the market decides the exchange rate, Mr. Trump. Meanwhile, of course, dollar up against the ruble. Ruble having a down day, unlike most of the emerging markets, 0.4% lower, bracing for the risk of new sanctions against election meddling.
And finally, commodities, green across the board, but nothing really too dramatic. Oil gaining 1.4%. And gold, I think that's like 2 days in a row for gold. So
$1,200.
back to $1,200 an ounce.
But it's risk on.
There you go.
Where's that haven?
Gold is the new risk on this. We'll do another segment on that. And those are today's market minutes.
What'd you miss? Michael Cohen, President Trump's longtime lawyer, is due to appear in a federal courtroom for his hearing. He's supposed to be there right now. And according to the New York Times, Cohen has reached a plea deal that does not include cooperation with the authorities. For more, let's welcome Bloomberg News financial investigations reporter Greg Farrell, Bloomberg News White House reporter Kevin Cirilli, former federal prosecutor Seth Waxman, and former federal prosecutor and Berkeley Research Group managing director Jeffrey Kramer. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today as we try to make sense of what's happening here. Greg, let me start with you, because we've known about this appearance before the federal courthouse for the last 2 hours. We've gotten dribs and drabs of reports of what will happen and won't happen. What are we likely to learn officially when Cohen does appear before the federal judge?
Well, we will learn the specific crimes he's pleading guilty to, which our reporting now shows as well. We've matched others that it involves campaign finance violations, as well as not bank fraud, but tax and finance irregularities as well. So the campaign finance will relate in some way to President Trump.
Kevin, what is the reaction right now at the White House to this news?
Well, they've tried to distance themselves in terms of their relationship with Michael Cohen. The president's longtime close personal confidant and attorney. We should note just how close Michael Cohen is to the former candidate and private citizen Donald Trump. This is someone who is deeply engulfed in the Trump organization, someone who has a deep and vast knowledge of the understanding of how the Trump organization operates. Now, we should also note, just reportedly, for what he is set to plead guilty to, in particular, the campaign finance violations, particularly with that hush money payment to Karen McDougal and Stormy Daniels. And, you know, we should also take a step back for a second and note that while this is set to be announced, a jury is still deliberating from Paul Manafort. Yes. And, of course, he is the president's former campaign chairman.
Seth, let's take it out to you, because we're just hearing that Michael Cohen is, in fact, appearing in the Manhattan federal court as we speak. And I want to get a take of really about the cooperation or lack thereof. There's been reports thus far that he is unlikely to cooperate with the U.S. What does that mean for Trump going forward, and indeed for what he might face in terms of jail sentence?
Yeah, it is very unusual for a person to enter into a plea agreement like this in a situation where Mr. Cohen is and not have a full cooperation agreement in place. So it is unusual. It could be the case that he is entering into a plea agreement in good faith with the notion that down the line somewhere, if the government's ready, would enter into some kind of agreement to seek a reduction in his sentence should he be truthful in all matters that he cooperates in. But it is unusual to have someone like this to enter into a plea without cooperation already having been worked out.
So what's the advantage to Michael Cohen to enter into this kind of plea agreement without that cooperation? Jeff, jump in here. If it is so unusual, does he have any leverage in this situation?
Well, the only leverage he has is he gets what's called acceptance of responsibility. In other words, he's made it easier for the government. There's less money the government has to spend to try him, and that could be considered by the judge in a sentence. But Seth is right. You don't see this sort of blind plea too often. There could be something coming down the line, or it could just be what we're seeing. He's going to plead blind. He's going to get acceptance of responsibility. He's going to be looking at anywhere possibly to 3 to 5 years, and hope the president gives him a little consideration down the line.
Greg, we're waiting for this press conference outside the courthouse. Any sense of how much detail they'd be inclined to give out here? Or could it be the kind of thing where someone walks out and says basically what the headlines are, and then they walk away?
Well, I think everybody's going to be focused. I'm not sure that many people care about Michael Cohen's taxi business and issues related to that.
More people care about his taxi business right now than just about everything else.
It's about the payment.
Right.
It's about Stormy Daniels. It's about a potential campaign violation, which is literally a sexy story, and it will have some legal implications for the president. I think that's what everybody's going to be tuned into.
But in terms of what the sort of typical thing is here of a press conference after a plea deal, would we expect a lot of detail, or would they be inclined to hold detail
No, not
back?
too much. They'll hold back. But prosecutors are very smart about this. They'll just, in the filings, there'll be enough details that there were other co-conspirators involved, and they'll leave it to our imaginations to figure out who the co-conspirators might be.
Got it.
Kevin, give us the bird's eye perspective here, because I'm looking at how the global market is watching this. Separate it, because you mentioned Manafort. What does this all mean for President Trump at the moment?
Well, President Trump is headed to West Virginia later this evening, where he's going to speak in Charleston, West Virginia, at a massive campaign-style rally. This will be the first time that we are expecting to hear directly from the president himself following this plea deal reached by Michael Cohen, the president's longtime personal confidant and attorney. Now, the second point that I would make is that senior administration officials earlier this afternoon announcing that the president will hit the campaign trail ahead of the midterms 40 days on the road ahead of the midterm elections. That is an ambitious and aggressive political strategy from the president ahead of the midterm elections. And finally, I would note just the EPA walkback in regulations that we saw. We've seen much more commentary from the financial sector with regards to the policy front. But to your point, the last point that I would make is that the juxtaposition of the personal confidant to the president of the United States, potentially likely now going to jail, and Paul Manafort, a jury still deliberating. They obviously broke. They had a question about one of the charges.
Yeah, just to
remarkable.
jump in there, Kevin, because the jury is submitting yet another note to the court in the Manafort case. That's just a headline just crossing.
Yeah, we'll continue to monitor this because we've got these two things going on at the same time. Seth, I want to turn over to you now because when we look at what's going to happen here with Michael Cohen, is there any way to tell how much prison time someone could get for campaign finance violations or bank fraud or tax fraud, these different charges that we presume Michael Cohen is going to be plead guilty to?
Yeah, sure. There are various maximum statutory penalties associated with each crime, but a judge won't sentence him to anywhere near those statutory maximums. There is the United States sentencing guidelines, and there's a fairly complex set of calculations prosecutors and the court go through to reach what is ultimately a fair sentence. Now, tax fraud and bank fraud are much, much more serious violations, and in large part are tied to the amount of money at issue. So if it's truly $20 million in bank fraud that Mr. Cohen is pleading to, that could be a huge number under the sentencing guidelines. It could be anywhere from 10 to 15 years of a sentencing guideline range, and there's no parole in the federal system, so he could serve about 85% of that, assuming good time. The campaign finance violations are much less serious offenses and may have a 1 to 3 year type of range involved. Of course, those are the crimes that may come closer to the president, but the judge also has a decision on whether to stack each one of those sentences above on top of each other or run them what's called concurrent together in time. So essentially he doesn't have to serve time over on top of each one of the individual crimes, and that's a decision the judge has to make.
Jeff, if no immediate cooperation, what does, if anything, President Trump have to be concerned about from today's ruling?
Well, today, nothing as far as Mr. Cohen is concerned, and then we'll see what happens with respect to Mr. Manafort. If there's any guilty verdicts there, he's got a finite period of time, perhaps, to cooperate. But certainly, there's a thread that's going through this. Not only Cohen, we saw a delayed of sentencing for General Flynn. That's obviously not good news for the president. So it's a steady drumbeat here of problems for people in and around his orbit at different time periods of his life.
Greg, I want to ask you sort of along the same lines. Obviously, this is in the Southern District. It's separate from the Mueller investigation. The Manafort thing is part of the Mueller investigation. But does it redound back in any way? Like, I mean, is there an interplay between this and what Mueller is?
It is separate. It's just being handled down in Manhattan. However, any information or anything that Cohen eventually does they share information, can go to Mueller. So I think there was probably a determination from the special counsel's office a few months ago that most of the stuff that was most obvious about Cohen was something that was appropriate for New York. However, if after this is announced today, the next step is that Cohen does want to offer something up to the prosecutors here, that would go to Mueller.
All right, so we might be in the beginning of a long process. We're not really clear yet on what happens next. Jeff, there was reportedly 5 months between the FBI's raids on Michael Cohen's offices and now these potential charges. Is that fast or is that slow? Give us some perspective here on where that tells us where we are in this process.
It is pretty fast. There's some districts that are quicker than others. Certainly, Southern District moved with haste on this one. But it was a pretty finite number of facts. They did a raid. They got a set of documents. The counts themselves are, frankly, not that hard to put together. The campaign finance one was pretty discreet. The bank fraud, prosecutors put that together regularly, and then the tax count flows from that. So it's not the most complicated of cases, but regardless, half a year is still moving pretty quickly.
And Kevin, lastly, I mean, we're expecting to see Trump on the road today, as you mentioned. Will we expect him to respond to anything, do you think?
Well, we're just getting some words crossing the terminal that Michael Cohen has arrived at court. He's wearing a dark suit, a gold tie. He's sitting in the front row at the federal courthouse. I'm sorry, senior officials from the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office sitting in the front row. I also want to note some congressional reaction that's beginning to pour in now, including from Congressman Joaquin Castro, a Democrat from Texas, who is mentioning the pardoning word and raising the question about perhaps Michael Cohen not saying that he will fully cooperate with the probe because he is maybe signaling to the administration that he would anticipate a pardon. That, of course, is speculation coming from Democratic Congressman Joaquin Castro.
We, of course, spoke to Joaquin Castro earlier today. Yep. Thanks to Bloomberg's Greg Farrell, Kevin Cirilli, and former federal prosecutors Jeffrey Kramer and Seth Waxman. You're all sticking with us from New York. This is Bloomberg.
I'm Mark Crumpton with First Word News. As we have been reporting this afternoon, President Trump's longtime lawyer and fixer, Michael Cohen, is in federal court in Manhattan. He's expected to plead guilty to federal charges stemming from hush payments to women who claim to have had affairs with the president before he took office. CNN reports that Cohen's plea deal includes jail time. Cohen has been under investigation for possible fraud. Meantime, for the second time today, the jury in the Paul Manafort fraud trial has submitted a note to the court. Earlier, jurors asked the judge what they should do if they couldn't agree on one of the 18 counts. Judge T.S. Ellis III urged jurors to keep trying. It's unclear what the second note says. Prosecutors say President Trump's former campaign chairman hid tens of millions in foreign income and lied on loan applications to obtain millions more. The European Union and Britain say they will accelerate Brexit negotiations and hold regular talks to try to bridge important differences in an effort to seal an agreement before the end of the year. EU chief Brexit negotiator Michel Barnier says that both sides, quote, have agreed that the EU and the UK will negotiate continuously from now on. Barnier's British counterpart, Dominic Raab, said that if both sides are pragmatic, quote, I am confident we can reach the agreement in October. Meantime, the British Secretary of State today spoke about Brexit. He said that he's confident the UK could become an exporting superpower. I'm Mark Crumpton. That's First Word News.
All right, we have some breaking news. Michael Cohen has pleaded guilty, according to the lawyer who told the judge that he has pleaded guilty. And again, we're still waiting to find out exactly which charges he's pleading guilty to. This was something we'd been reporting for the last 2 hours. What we're told, according to our reporting, is that he is not cooperating as part of this plea agreement, but we'll be finding out more as the story develops. So we want to bring back in our panel of guests. We have Seth Waxman, a former federal prosecutor, along with Jeffrey Kramer, a former federal prosecutor, as well as Kevin Cirilli, our chief Washington correspondent. And Seth, let me start with you, because I'm looking here at the Bloomberg, and we've been kind of live blogging the events here. And as Michael Cohen arrived in the Manhattan federal court, what do you see, Carolyn?
So Cohen is to plead to 8 counts pursuant to
there we
the
go.
deal, we see, the lawyer says. So 8 counts. We're yet to have a breakdown on whether, of course, that's in particular to do with campaign finance laws, whether it's bank fraud, whether it's wire fraud. But we're certainly starting to get a little bit more of a breakdown as to exactly what the counts are about. All
right, Seth, let me bring you back in here. Now that we know that he's pleading guilty to 8 different counts, if, as Kevin mentioned, the P word, pardon, is kind of being thrown around here in Washington, if there is a pardon here, would the president need to pardon him on each different count, or he just kind of grants a blanket pardon?
Well, no, he'd have to address each count and pardon him on each count. You know, in my mind, if President Trump were to pardon Mr. Cohen under these circumstances, you know, what we know in the at least public atmosphere, at least from what even Mr. Cohen has said, that he has information to share that could be incriminating to the president, that may be the definition of obstruction of justice, to impede or hinder a federal investigation. Now, the president can pardon an individual. That power is sacrosanct under the Constitution, but it doesn't mean that he can't suffer ramifications from taking a step like that, you know, for example, in impeachment proceedings. So to pardon either Mr. Manafort if he were convicted or Mr. Cohen after a conviction in a case where he allegedly or may have some criminal exposure himself would really be tantamount to obstruction of justice in my mind.
Jeffrey, is that your read as well with regards to a theoretical Trump pardon?
Yeah, I think that argument can certainly be made that way. While the presidential pardon is absolute, and I think given DOJ policy, a sitting president cannot be indicted. All of this goes into Mr. Mueller's report to Congress. And here you have some very salient points as to why Mr. Cohen was pardoned or Manafort was pardoned, if we go down that line for a moment. And it does make a compelling argument. Certainly the president is implicated in Mr. Cohen's payments to the 2 women. Mr. Cohen didn't do this because he was having an affair. It was because Mr. Trump was. So I think it does give Congress, if we get to that point, some good arguments to pursue impeachment.
Kevin, it's funny, we're talking here about theoretical pardons, but obviously, like, Trump hasn't done anything like that yet. And people keep speculating, like, oh, is he going to fire Mueller, or is he going to fire Sessions and then use that as an opportunity to fire Mueller? And people have been debating about this for months and months. But he hasn't really touched directly into any investigations directly on him. Is the White House sort of like, is there a view that he knows to be restrained on this stuff?
Well, three things. First and foremost, if you look at polling, it would suggest that the base of the Republican Party is still very much behind President Trump. A recent CBS poll that was released last week found that 7 in 10 Republicans are still believe the president when he says that the special counsel is a quote-unquote witch hunt. That, of course, coming directly from the president himself. The second point that I would make is that last year, right behind me, President Trump addressing on Pebble Beach, as it's called here in Washington, reporters saying that he was defending Paul Manafort. He called it a sad day to see what was happening to Paul Manafort. That was the last time that we've heard him aggressively defend Paul Manafort, and even in the same week, retweeting Michael Cohen for seemingly refuting a book put out by former aide Omarosa Manigault-Newman. So you've seen him weigh in on Paul Manafort and Michael Cohen. The third point that I would make is that we're about to get documents. We're about to see specifically what Michael Cohen pleads guilty to. And in those documents, as what everyone has just excellently pointed out, should he name President Trump in any of these whatever he's pleading guilty to, that would be a remarkable new primary source of information for the special counsel, Bob Mueller's team, to look over.
And that would be information that would be shared between the two different teams. I'm looking at a headline here that Michael Cohen has told the judge he wants to plead guilty. So earlier we had told you that the lawyer was saying Michael Cohen would plead guilty, and he would plead guilty. He would plead to 8 counts pursuant to the plea deal. Now he is Michael Cohen himself has told the judge he wants to plead guilty.
We've also got a new headline on the Manafort case. Of course, the Manafort jury has reached a verdict in case. When it doesn't rain, it pours when it comes to these sorts of things. Let's take it back out to Seth, because the Manafort jury couldn't reach a verdict on 10 counts, we're being told at the moment, Seth. Really, can you illustrate to us how difficult the deliberations would have been? And we do understand that they've reached a verdict and they couldn't reach a verdict on 10 counts.
So just so I'm understanding, you're saying that they've reached a verdict on 8 counts, but not on 10? Is that the news you're getting?
The Manafort jury reaches a verdict in the case, the headline says. The Manafort jury couldn't reach a verdict on 10 counts, but they have reached a verdict in the case. We'll wait for some more breaking news before we perhaps throw it out to you, but give us a sense of how difficult the deliberations might have been throughout this, and we'll keep on bringing you the breaking news as and when we get it.
Sure. I mean, jury deliberations can be very heated. There's a lot of passion. There's a lot of strong opinions in those rooms, but that's the way our system is set up. And in my experience, juries get it right more often than not. So, obviously this afternoon they came back and had a note that said they were hung on at least 1 or more counts. It seems that they've either worked some of those out or rendered what in fact is a partial verdict right now, if the reporting is, what we're hearing now is accurate. And in fact, the judge may not take that verdict. In fact, I don't think he will. He'll say, look, continue your deliberations until you can reach a verdict or suggest to them that they can continue their deliberations till they feel like they've exhausted their efforts. So it could be the case that they are instructed to go back and continue their deliberations, but the notion that there are at least several convictions or acquittals for that matter at this point is a defining moment, obviously, in the proceedings.
And let me just jump in. We have some clarification from our producer who says that Paul Manafort faced 18 counts. So when Carolyn was saying the jury couldn't reach verdict on 10 counts, it does seem like there was a partial verdict here because the jury has reached a verdict overall.
Jeffrey, we obviously don't know which way these verdicts on the 8 counts are going to go, but I'm curious from the perspective of a prosecutor. This is very politically charged stuff, and we live in a time in which people of different political persuasions frequently can't agree on a common set of facts. How challenging is it for prosecutors in this environment to prosecute a case like this when so much of this can be so polarizing?
Good question.
Yeah, that's a fair point. You try to divorce yourself, obviously, here from the politics and the atmospherics, and that usually does happen. Once you get into an evidence, the jury is looking at it, who they voted for, what their political beliefs might be, are kind of removed, and they just focus on the actual evidence. In this case in particular, it was a pretty straightforward case. I've been on trials that have lasted 4 and 5 months where the jury's been out weeks and weeks. This was pretty easy. They were out a few days. They didn't agree on some counts, apparently, which is normal. And so it's up to the judge either, as I said, to take the partial verdict, or we'll ask them if they think future deliberations will be beneficial. The jury will come back yes or no. But at some point, the judge will take that verdict, I think.
All right, and just to recap here, we're following twin cases with the Manafort jury reaching a verdict in its case, even as it seems it's a partial verdict because the jury couldn't reach verdict on 10 counts out of 18 counts. Meantime, in New York, we're hearing that Michael Cohen has told the judge that he wants to plead guilty. Kevin Cirilli, our chief Washington correspondent in Washington, who is, or what team or what case is President Trump more worried about? The Michael Cohen case or the Paul Manafort case?
You know, that's a great question. I think that just the fact that this is a logical question, I think shows just how severe this is. This is the president's longtime fixer. This is someone, Michael Cohen, this is someone who was just earlier this spring spotted at the Trump Hotel with members of his family, talking to members of the inner circle.
Yeah.
And just to see the complete reversal in that.
Kevin, let me
Paul
just jump in for a second here because we're getting details on the charges Michael Cohen is being charged with. He's being charged with evading personal income tax. He's also charged with unlawful corporate campaign contribution, and he's charged with a false statement to financial institutions. So we knew there was some realm of bank fraud, tax fraud, and campaign finance. Specifically, the charges are evading personal income tax, unlawful corporate campaign contribution, a false statement to a financial institution, and in addition, a new headline, excessive campaign contribution in October of 2016. Excessive campaign contribution. Does that sound like a payment to you, Kevin?
Well, you know, yes, that particular charge, and I'm getting these details just as you are, that particular charge relates, could relate, and I want to be clear here, with regards to the Stormy Daniels allegation, with regards to that payment, and that's seemingly where we're headed with that.
Seth, we don't know which way the verdict is going to go in Paul Manafort yet. In theory, however, suppose he were to be found guilty on some charges or perhaps more than what we have right now, could there be a cooperation between verdict and sentencing?
Yes, absolutely. There's something called Rule 35 that allows the judge to reduce a person's sentence and allows the government to cooperate with an individual post-verdict or even post-sentencing for a year. And that can actually be extended further than that for good cause. So it's always sort of been my opinion that these two trials, the one here in Virginia and the one that's scheduled in D.C. for the fall, while righteous charges probably on their own and independent cases that are brought about against Mr. Manafort, that in large part that's been done to potentially flip Mr. Manafort. So he'll have that opportunity, and I think it's the prosecution's hope, at least, that if there's a conviction, that they'll be able to bring him into the fold as a cooperator.
And talk to us, therefore, Jeff, about going forward the jury, because we know that the judge was particularly tough talking on them throughout the deliberations. It's clearly been a difficult set of deliberations, knowing that they haven't been able to take a view on 10 of them when it comes to the Manafort case. What do you think are the repercussions for juries going forward, and indeed whether there'll be any looking at how they came to these decisions and any questioning of it?
You know, I really don't think there's going to be any grand scheme of things coming forward with respect to how juries react or how they deal with these cases if there's other cases going forward. And it's hard to look at this case just as U.S. v. Manafort because of all the atmospherics, as I said, but it really is just the bank fraud case and the tax case. I don't think there's any lessons to be learned from a jury on this one. They came to what presumably a partial verdict. That's happening probably a dozen times this week in different courtrooms, state and federally. So it really isn't that unusual, but for the fact that Mr. Manafort worked for Mr. Trump for several months.
What happens next when it comes to the Manafort jury? It reaches a verdict in the case, Seth, but there's obviously a lag here between reaching a verdict and sentencing, if anything. How crucial will the White House reaction be at this point, or is that out of the picture?
Well, as a criminal procedure matter, after a conviction, there's about 60 or 90 days that are passed between that point in time and sentencing. And during that time frame, court employees and others prepare sentencing information for the judge. The parties submit their recommendation to the judge. And Jeffrey, as he said, these things happen every day in courthouses across the country. What the president may do in those 60 days, be it a pardon, be it weighing in on this particular case in one way or the other, that may happen. A pardon obviously is an X factor that can really change things. But, the president chiming in, I don't think will have a whole lot of impact during those 60 to 90 days. Sentencing can be put off as well for any number of reasons. That this criminal process will, follow its normal course, and ultimately he'd be sentenced by a judge. Unless there's a pardon, or, of course, he can cooperate, and that may change things as well.
Kevin, it's obviously, just to back up, an extraordinary day with two people who are incredibly close to the president, both in court at different times. Extraordinary day for news. This president is the master of changing the story, I think, and the master of distraction. So what's it going to be? What are we all going to be talking about tomorrow that Trump will have everyone scurrying for?
Well, we're going to hear from him. I mean, he's literally en route to Charleston, West Virginia, where he is going to be addressing supporters, talking about what was supposed to be a policy campaign, political speech about deregulatory environmental protection standards. Now, of course, it becomes the first time that we'll be hearing him since, one, a partial verdict has been reached in Paul Manafort's case, and two, Michael Cohen pleads guilty with regards to details that we're just getting from that front. So whether or not he takes that head on, we don't know. I would just note the political implications of this. There are centrist Republicans up on Capitol Hill who have been advocating. I just interviewed Senator Kennedy before coming on air earlier this afternoon, who made the case that they want to see more policy with regards to Russia sanctions because of what has gone on in the midterms. So, whether or not you have centrist Republicans who are emboldened to join the critics who have been very critical of this administration with regards to the Democratic Party, we're going to have to wait and see. Also, I can't stress this point enough. What new information will we get in the primary source material that we're about to receive from Michael Cohen's plea deal?
That's a really good point. Let's bring in Bloomberg News financial investigations reporter Greg Farrell. Greg, what new information are we likely to get? I mean, and how quickly can we get it, that kind of primary information that Kevin was mentioning?
Well, there'll be lots of detail on the charges that Cohen's pleading guilty to, including a campaign finance violation. I think we've seen it written. Presumably, there'll be someone identified as co-conspirator 1 or co-conspirator 2 that some people might presume is the president or, a key person. On the Manafort case, we have a guilty plea, but what we don't know yet until the jury comes in are which 8 counts. And there's a real separation between the bank fraud counts, which are serious violations and carry up to 30 years each, and other crimes which are related to registering your foreign account and tax. And I would imagine that'll make a difference in how the president responds to it. If it's not bank fraud, if it's these cases about, well, he didn't properly account for his foreign tax account, these are the type of things that the president has either denigrated or just minimized as not real crimes in other commentary. The president has pardoned a lot of people so far, particularly this year, for other white-collar crimes, and he's had a habit of diminishing the significance of certain white-collar crimes. So it'll be important to see where the conviction is.
Just to be clear, there's 18 counts, no verdict on 10. Do we know what's the split between how many are bank fraud and how many are the taxes?
Off the top of my head, I think it's. I think it's more than 8. No, I think it's like 6 or so are bank fraud charges.
Okay.
I wouldn't say it's 666, but there is a mix of, foreign reporting, tax violations, and bank fraud charges. So the 8 could be a bit of some, or some of the first 2 and not the latter.
Seth, going back to Michael Cohen, his lawyer is superstar lawyer Laney Davis. One of the few household names in law, someone who historically has been associated with the Clinton world. I know we don't want to speculate about whether at some point he's going to cooperate or whatever, but would you bring in someone of Laney's caliber if it's just, we're going to have a normal plea deal and sort of do 3 to 5 years and move on?
No, I mean, the team that Mr. Cohen has put together are obviously very high-priced and very experienced lawyers. So the notion that he is just walking in, pleading to a significant number of counts with no potential benefit somewhere, either now or down the line, would be very surprising to me. Again, this is really unusual. Typically, these sorts of things are worked out entirely. They're called global pleas or pleas that, extinguish all of his criminal exposure. And of course, on the other side of that, the government gets cooperation. So a big question is, has Mr. Cohen sat down and told prosecutors what he knows, or is the prosecution just waiting? Even if they don't want to use Mr. Cohen as a witness down the line.
We got to jump in here for a sec.
Sure.
We have a headline here that there's a mistrial on 10 counts in the Manafort fraud trial. Paul Manafort found guilty on at least 1 count was the verdict. So again, a mistrial on 10 counts out of 18 in this Manafort fraud trial. Paul Manafort found guilty on at least 1 count.
And Kevin, I mean, the fact that we've seen Paul Manafort, this trial is the first for special counsel Robert Mueller. The fact that we've got Paul Manafort found guilty on at least 1 count, what does that mean?
Well, we don't know what specific charge that will be, and we'll be waiting eagerly to find that out. I also want to read now a statement that we have gotten from the Senate Intelligence Committee, this coming from a Republican, Senator Burr, and Senator Mark Warner, a Democrat. They say they're following closely the Michael Cohen case. And a quote, "What we can say is that we recently re-engaged with Mr. Cohen and his team following press reports that suggested he had advanced knowledge of the June 2016 meeting between campaign officials and the Russian attorneys at Trump Tower." They go on to say in their statement that that he stands by his testimony, Michael Cohen's original testimony, and that they hope the developments in the plea agreement today will not preclude his appearance before our committee as needed for our ongoing investigation. So Republicans now and Democrats from the Senate Intelligence Committee putting out a statement saying that he could still testify before Congress.
We just got some more breaking details. Manafort is found guilty on all 5 tax fraud counts, it would seem. So we're getting a breakdown. Manafort found guilty also on 1 count of failing to file an FBAR. So we're starting to get the details really eking out. And Kevin, you're still hearing from, of course, other lawmakers as we speak.
Yes, lawmakers saying from the Senate Intelligence Committee that has emerged as the top committee in the Senate that is investigating a host of these different investigations that have gone on both in New York and the federal prosecution as well. And of course, Special Counselor Robert Mueller. A lot of these folks might still have to testify publicly on Capitol Hill, at least according to the Senate Intel Committee.
Kevin, let me just jump in here because we've learned now as well that Paul Manafort was found guilty on 2 counts of bank fraud. So just to wrap it all up here, and Greg, I'm going to come to you on this. Manafort found guilty on 2 counts of bank fraud, found guilty on 1 count of failing to file FBAR, so paperwork essentially. Manafort found guilty on all 5 tax fraud counts, but there was a mistrial on 10 counts in this trial. What happens to the 10 counts versus these individual 1 or 2 counts where he is found guilty?
Nothing. The mistrial means that prosecutors could go back and retry him on that. I don't think, especially since Manafort is facing a different trial in Washington, D.C. next month, that they're going to, get overly worked up about this. The key thing is the prosecutors got convictions, and particularly the bank fraud elements, the most serious ones. That's a victory. A mistrial in all 18 would be a failure and a big embarrassment, but this is a victory for Mueller.
Just to jump in here, and because we're going to switch gears to the other case, Michael Cohen's sentencing guideline calls for 46 to 63 months. So again, this is just one headline that crossed here on Michael Cohen's sentencing guideline calls for 46 to 63 months. That doesn't necessarily mean, Jeff Kramer, that it's going to be 46 to 63 months, right? I mean, there's a lot of room there to bring that down.
Correct. Historically, judges were kind of confined within that box, but now this judge can go down as far as they feel is necessary, and certainly there may be some input from the prosecutors. That's how the Southern District does it. They'll just give the pros and the cons and leave it up to the judge, but he's not locked into anything.
And Jeffrey, based on your read of the, switching gears again, back to Manafort, the mix of guilty verdicts between the tax fraud, and the bank fraud. What is your general assessment of the result?
That's true. If you're a prosecutor, you're smiling right now. You've done your job. Certainly these professionals have. The fact that there were a handful of counts that the jury couldn't agree to is fine. It would be interesting if it was, a close verdict split or if it was just one or two holdouts. But all that evidence still gets subsumed into the sentencing that's go before. So if you're Mr. Manafort, a 69-year-old man, you're looking at double digits in prison. So for him, this is probably the worst day of his life.
And one other point to that is the way this was handled. There have been questions about maybe Manafort could now offer to cooperate. No, he put the government through a trial. He expended government resources to try to get a conviction. Cohen, in contrast, Cohen decided to come in and plead. So there would be, even though they're not linked at all, Cohen will be the beneficiary of having not put the government through that great expense of time and energy and money. So there'll be some benefit for him that there won't be for Manafort.
Seth, let's go back to you, and just as we run through again, the Manafort trial in particular, found guilty on all 5 tax fraud counts. We've got 2 counts he's found guilty on in terms of bank fraud and 1 count on failing to file some documents, the FBAR. What do you make of these rulings and the way in which they've come to be?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can consider this anything but a sweeping victory for the prosecution. It's not all counts, but if you get someone on several tax evasion charges and bank fraud charges, those are 20 and 30-year offenses at max. Under the sentencing guidelines, I agree with Jeff entirely. He's definitely looking at double-digit sentencing, jail time. And if the judge were to stack those criminal convictions, it could be upwards of close to 19 to 20 or plus years. So this is a sweeping victory for the government and really puts Mr. Manafort in a box as to he only has 2 ways out, essentially, to avoid spending essentially the rest of his life in jail. It's a pardon or to cooperate. And, we just don't know if either of those things are going to happen.
Cooperation would mean what in your mind, Seth?
Walking into the prosecutor's office and saying, you got me, now I need a deal. And in my mind, they will give him a deal. It won't be anywhere near as good as they would have if he hadn't put the government through its paces. But look, there were only 3 people in that Trump Tower meeting in June of 2016, Manafort, Don Jr., and Kushner. And to have someone on the inside of that meeting saying what took place and potentially what the conversations were like before, during, and after that meeting, by all accounts, seems to be a very important part to Mr. Mueller's investigation. And so while they won't like it, the government won't like it, that they were put through their paces, in my mind, they will still take him in as a cooperator and use him to the full extent they can.
Yes, and furthermore, they have Rick Gates, Manafort's deputy, already in their pocket. Gates testified in the Manafort trial, and Gates is sort of a mini-me to Manafort. He knows a lot of what Manafort knows, but as Seth pointed out, he was not in that meeting. That meeting, and possibly a few other meetings that were personally just Manafort, would make it worth their while to cut some kind of a deal.
All right, let me just jump in here because we have some more headlines on Michael Cohen. So let's just switch gears back to the Michael Cohen situation. Again, he is at the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan. Michael Cohen says he violated a campaign law at the direction of a candidate, but he does not name the candidate who directed campaign violation. Wow. So again, Michael Cohen says he violated campaign law at the direction of the candidate, but he doesn't name the candidate who directed the campaign violation.
Kevin saying, wow.
Greg.
Yeah, that is...
Go ahead, Kevin.
That's remarkable. Yeah, that's remarkable. I apologize for jumping in, but the specific wording here, the direction of a candidate, that of course will be scrutinized. Many people will say that who will push for Michael Cohen to name specifically who that is. Did candidate Donald Trump instruct Michael Cohen to move the money with regards to this payment? If that is the case, that presents a massive problem for President Trump. And that now is the key central question regarding the Michael Cohen plea deal.
And just to add to that, Cohen paid $130,000, he says, and was later repaid by candidate who is not named. Carolyn.
I don't mean to be dumb. Is there another theoretical candidate that
Did
Michael
he work for
Cohen
anyone else?
Did
Yes.
Hillary Clinton? No, she wouldn't have paid.
I mean...
Kevin, is there anyone?
No, I mean, look, yeah, no, I think that is a logical question. That's a fair question. I think that really truly becomes the question: is who specifically is that candidate, and what specifically is there documentation, that is there evidence that would support that?
Kevin.
He's pleading guilty to that.
And we're just hearing that the Cohen says he acted for the purpose of influencing the election. I mean, this sort of drip feed is quite sensational.
Yes, it is remarkable to influence the election. I mean, and again, I would just note just how important now the words become in these primary source materials, because as you just read, to influence, that was the motive, that was the intent, was to influence the election, to issue this payment, to prevent a negative type of story from being made public that would impact the outcome of an election, and that he was instructed to do so by a candidate. But I do want to note here that Michael Cohen said he did not, at least reportedly several months ago, said he did not have tapes of that particular conversation. You'll remember the Michael Cohen tapes when they first came out, that he did not have tapes of candidate Donald Trump instructing him to do so. So, is there evidence to suggest that candidate Donald Trump did in fact instruct Michael Cohen, his longtime fixer, his longtime personal attorney, to make that payment for the intent of influencing the election, as he has pleaded guilty to now to prosecutors?
Greg, what does it mean for the unnamed candidate, this headline?
Singular, unnamed candidate.
Candidate.
Right. Did they say, candidate? Yeah, what would it mean for a theoretical unnamed candidate that they theoretically...
there's two parts of this. There's the actual technical legal problem that candidate might face, and that John Edwards did face a few years ago, and Edwards was not convicted on that. So it's not necessarily a damning violation, but it is, as Kevin just pointed out, a big political problem. So there's a legal problem with this, which is, not like a nuclear bomb size problem, but there's a political issue that's much larger.
Is it nuclear bomb?
Is it nuclear bomb level?
No, because I think nuclear bomb would be Russia. I think this again it's a political problem. It's much bigger than the legal problem, but it's not. Robert Mueller's job is to find any examples of overt Russian interference with Trump campaign officials. That is, still the ultimate point.
Right, there are specific parameters there. Jeff Kramer, jump in here from Chicago. Talk to us about what this means, what kind of problems this creates for the unnamed candidate here that. Michael Cohen says he acted for the purpose of influencing the election. He violated the campaign law at the direction of this unnamed candidate.
That's true. I mean, there's two buckets. One's political, one's legal. The political ramifications, everyone would just be guessing, and we might be guessing wrong because nothing seems to bother this president and his supporters. This may be under that umbrella. The second item, with respect to legal, I think it's crucial. It's the most important information we've had to date. While there's been musings about the president influencing Cohen to make these payments, now we have it from Cohen himself. So that certainly is relevant. It's a campaign finance violation, theoretically. So again, you have to put it on a scale. Is it the worst crime ever? Absolutely not. Does it feed into Mueller's investigation with respect to anything that might go in a report? Yes, but it just stops there at the campaign violation. If that's all it is, if there's nothing to do with Russia, Mueller's primary target, et cetera, then this may just go away with history. It's not that big a deal with respect to a report to Congress.
And I just want to point out that amid all of this, all of these extraordinary headlines, we are seeing a little bit of a sell-off in after-hours futures. Here is a chart of S&P futures, and you can see it sliding to its lows of the day there. And so to whatever extent markets aren't crazy about the prospect of all of this political drama towards people so close to the president, we see a little bit of selling. Nothing huge.
Not just in equity futures, but also in dollar yen as well. You see the dollar losing some strength here versus the Japanese yen. The yen tends to gain as a safe haven, so you're seeing the dollar lose some momentum here as we get more details of both the Cohen case and the Manafort case.
And I think this is, from the global perspective here, this is what the repercussions are. This is why these court cases are so important. It's not just about US politics. This is global ramifications, because it's all about whether or not there might indeed be some sort of theoretical impeachment. And Jeff, going back to you, you were talking about whether there might be some sort of theoretical element to all of that. Where does this go forward in terms of the ramifications for President Trump?
Well, this just is one section of the report. It's pretty constrained. It just deals with campaign finance. It's not dealing with Russia. It's not dealing with hacking. It's not dealing with the meeting at Trump Tower, et cetera. So it is part of the report. Does it push does it push Congress over the edge? Not in and of it by itself. It needs to have something else. So that something else is Manafort. But it is certainly, and drama is the right word for it. The Obama years were staid compared to what we've seen just within the last few hours, unfortunately. And it is unfortunate. It's unfortunate for Mr. Manafort. There isn't a prosecutor around that relishes looking at a defendant going to jail for 10 years and how it influences his family. Sentences are very difficult for prosecutors that have been in it for a while. And this is no exception. But prosecutors are doing what they have to, which is basically squeezing Mr. Manafort for everything he knows. And if he can give them information, that will also go into the report, certainly much more highlighted.
To jump in here with another headline, the judge in the Michael Cohen case has accepted Michael Cohen's guilty pleas. Again, he's pleaded guilty to each of 8 counts, Joe.
Seth, we've kind of been somewhat perplexed at this whole thing of the unnamed candidate upon whose behalf some of these actions Michael Cohen took. Is there a reason, though, formally why he may not be inclined to name the unnamed candidate, even though lots of people will sort of jump to assumptions about who that might be?
Sure. There's a Department of Justice policy that says in court documents, you do not name people in those documents that aren't being charged. Unindicted co-conspirator, candidate number A, person number X, company number or letter B. That's because we don't want to impugn people for charges that they haven't been found responsible for. In other words, probable cause by a grand jury hasn't been found. So you always use monikers like that to protect the reputation and name of people who haven't been officially charged. With that said, who is candidate A or we're talking about, it can be no one else but the president, Mr. Trump. And that will become obvious, I think, as we're seeing these documents and the circumstances surrounding these transfers of funds.
Greg, I mean, is all pardoning out the window if it has to be a direct line to one candidate, and that being Trump?
Correct. And right, as Seth just pointed out, I mean, I helped cover the Elliot Spitzer, news 10 years ago. He was referred to first in a case against a madam as client number 9. So, right, there's various steps. They're right. Today it's just about Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen is the one who's pleading guilty. Michael Cohen is the one who's named, and other people are, just referred to by,
So this is just all
Yes, this is exactly.
And meanwhile, Cohen, it's been said, Michael Cohen will have sentencing set for December the 12th.
Yeah, it's just mind-boggling, the headlines that have crossed over the last 2 hours. I mean, if we recap everything that's happened, if you start with Paul Manafort, the jury has reached a verdict in the case, but it was a partial verdict because Paul Manafort was found guilty on at least one count, actually on all 5 tax fraud counts, 1 count of failing to file FBAR documents, 2 counts of bank fraud, but there was a mistrial on 10 counts. But as, Greg, you've made pretty clear, this is a victory for the prosecution.
Yes, it's a win.
Because they
Absolutely.
got
They got a conviction.
half.
They got a conviction on 8 counts.
Is Cohen a victory if it's so clearly deemed candidate being candidate Trump?
Cohen's a victory, too. They didn't have to. This was very quick, as this was discussed earlier. It only took a few months for the prosecutors to put this together. Cohen decided to not fight it. They had everything. Once they raided his apartment and his office, they had everything. So there was no way out.
Kevin, the White House has been urging publicly on Twitter through Rudy Giuliani on cable news for Mueller to wrap it up and say, okay, you've done this for a long time. We've been hearing that for a while, Republicans telling Mueller to wrap it up. The events of today, did they change that? Does this mean we're still in the early innings of the Mueller story?
It's been interesting because as we've been talking, as these reports have been coming out, there's been the emergence of rhetoric coming from Democrats, people like Senator Mark Warner, who are saying that any effort to pardon Paul Manafort or Michael Cohen would be the wrong decision and would be something that they would not suggest, obviously, for President Trump to do. I have not been able to find any comments coming from Republicans. Now, we're set to hear from President Trump himself later this evening in just about 2 hours, where the president will address supporters in Charleston, West Virginia, what was supposed to be dubbed as an energy policy speech. Whether or not he goes off script, as he sometimes has a tendency to do, we'll have to wait and see. But with respect to the political implications of this, I think you really touched on an important point to note here, Joe, which is that the vast majority of Republicans in the Republican base, according to polls, would suggest that they still very much stand by this president in terms of his criticism of the special counsel as being a witch hunt. Now, clearly, 3 in 10 Republicans, according to that CBS poll, the latest poll that we have on this, would suggest that they don't believe it's been a witch hunt.
All right, let me just bring in our U.S. legal reporter, who is going to join us now from the Manafort courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia. David Voriakis is there now. And David, we heard the Manafort judge has released a jury in the fraud case for the last time. Give us a summary once again of what happened today at the Manafort trial.
Paul Manafort was convicted today of 5 counts of tax fraud, 1 count of failing to file a foreign bank account report, or FBAR, and 2 counts of bank fraud. So that's 8 of the 18 counts in the indictment. On the other 10 counts, which include 5 counts of bank fraud conspiracy, the judge declared a mistrial. Manafort returned to custody in the jail here in Alexandria, Virginia, because he faces a second trial on September 17th in Washington on money laundering charges, as well as obstruction of justice and failing to file as a foreign agent. Now, he faces several years in prison. It's hard to say how many, but this is clearly a win for the team of special counsel Robert Mueller and a defeat for the defense. I mean, the defense was able to whittle down some of the charges, but still he's facing several years in prison, and now he's a convicted felon.
David, so there's going to be a whole new trial for Manafort. Assuming he faces perhaps decades in prison, do they really do the whole thing over again?
That's not really clear whether they are going to go through with the second trial. I mean, they certainly intend to at this moment, but they haven't stated otherwise. I guess they have to analyze what their options are. And the judge also is giving them until the end of August to figure out whether they want to retry the 10 counts for which he declared a mistrial. So theoretically, Manafort could face a third trial. That seems pretty unlikely. I mean, it appears that the government has achieved their goals with this series of convictions today.
Just to follow up there, I mean, can you give us a perspective of what this means for the special investigations of Robert Mueller going forward?
Yeah, this was the first case to go to trial for special counsel Robert Mueller, and so it was his first courtroom test in which the witnesses were cross-examined and the evidence was subject to public scrutiny. And Mueller had previously charged 32 people, including Manafort. So this was the first time that a jury passed judgment on a defendant charged by Robert Mueller.
In addition to that, David, this was not a cakewalk. The judge, did he not put up some obstacles over the last few weeks for the prosecution? So this was not an easy case, was it, David?
It was a difficult courtroom fight. It was good lawyering on both sides. Manafort, who did not testify or put on any witnesses, had some excellent lawyers who were former tax prosecutors, and they raised a number of legal issues, and the jury believed them on a majority of the counts. And the judge also issued a number of rulings that tended to favor the defense and had a general courtroom demeanor that was more favorable to the defense than to the prosecutors. But the prosecutors, in the end, assembled a pretty powerful case, and the jury agreed with them. And so it would have to be seen as a victory for Mueller.